perspective of intergenerational and racial justice and the moral and legal rights of children to a healthy climate. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists, Reverend Susan Hendershot, IPL President, who will moderate the conversation. Welcome, Susan. And Christi Cooper, she's the filmmaker of the film Youth v. Gov, who started her professional life as a scientist with a PhD in neuroscience and then went on to get a degree in filmmaking. Her first project was a series of 10 short films about a group of young people suing the government over climate change, which led to her award-winning feature-length film, Youth v. Gov. Welcome, Christi. And Miko Vergun from Beaverton, Oregon, joined the case at the age of 14. Miko believes that children and youth need to speak up about climate change and stand up to world leaders and let them know how climate change is greatly impacting their future. Now 20 years old, they attend Oregon State University studying digital communication arts. Their connection to their faith, Judaism, has been a great influence in their activism. Welcome, Miko. And finally, Nathan Bering grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska, and saw early on the impacts of climate change, joining the suit Juliana versus the United States at the age of 16. Nathan is now a student at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota studying political science. He hopes to learn federal Indian law long-term to support tribal sovereignty and development efforts in Alaska. He comes from a Quaker tradition, which has formed a core part of his values in advocacy. Welcome, Nathan. And to the rest of you, we'll keep an eye out for your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll have dedicated time for your questions at the end, but we'll let Susan get started with some questions.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank Sarah for her hard work in pulling together this webinar this evening and working with Christi and Nathan and Miko for our panelists this evening. And I also want to thank Ashiki Scott, our program associate at IPL, who is running tech for us and who will be monitoring the questions from the audience for discussion later on this evening. And of course, I want to thank our three panelists, Christi, Nathan, and Miko, for being here this evening and spending some time with us and talking about your experiences. I want to start out by saying that, I'm really honored to be here with you this evening. I just found the film so compelling. And I also felt like I rode the emotional roller coaster with all of you throughout the film as you were going through the highs and lows of the multi-year court battles that you were engaged in. And when you were laughing, I was laughing. And when you were, sad or angry, I was sad and angry. And I just felt like all of that within me as well. So just a really amazing film and really amazing advocacy that you are doing on behalf really of all of us. So I want to thank you for that. And Christi, I want to start with you because you are the filmmaker who pulled this together. And I know that you have quite an impressive background in science and academia, and you moved into filmmaking. And so I just wonder if you could share a little bit about what your motivation was to, shift from your academic career and to take up social justice filmmaking.
Sure. Thanks, Susan, and thank you, Sarah and Ashiki. It's so nice to be here this evening. And we just, to all of the participants, thank you so much for being involved in the Faith Climate Action Week and for sharing Youth v. Gov with your congregations. It's been amazing for Olivia and me to see the engagement and involvement. And it's we're very honored to be a part of it this year. So my background as a neuroscientist, I was working as a researcher, clinical researcher in Europe. I was in Germany and Sweden, and my kind of transition into wanting to delve a little bit more into storytelling kind of started around the Bush-Kerry elections way back when. And it was spurred by the political debate around stem cells. And that stem cells really became a talking hot point within our country around a scientific topic that most people did not know very much about. And it struck me as a scientist that we also have an obligation to do better around public awareness and understanding of science with the public. And so I kind of began shifting at that point, and our research group did as well, and trying to explain our stem cell research that we were doing. And when I was in Sweden, I joined a interdisciplinary EU grant where we were creating science fairs that were traveling around Europe. And it was really interesting to me to see how the storytelling component around the science was so impactful. And so that was kind of that was kind of the impetus, I guess, for me of wanting to shift from academia and moving more into the storytelling and communications component. And so I moved back to the US and I got my MFA in science and natural history filmmaking, thinking I would be focused, very solely on science-based films. And that very quickly became obvious that wasn't what drove me, or was not my passion, and wasn't what spoke to my heart. So I very early got involved with a Native American tribe in Southwest Louisiana while I was in school. This was during the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, and they're a marginalized group outside of the levee system, and they were very impacted by the oil spill. And I learned so much from this community about marginalized communities, and so much about the racial injustices around climate change and environmental degradation. So that's kind of what was the hook for me, and I've kind of been in that world ever since.
Mm. Thank you for that background. And so, throughout all of that, now you sort of moved into this really long, multi-year project with Our Children's Trust, the Juliana versus the United States case. Can you just tell us a little bit about what drew you to make a film about the case? Why did you care about it?
So in 2011, I came onto a project together with Witness, which is a social justice human rights organization, to create 10 short films about cases that Our Children's Trust was bringing in. They were various state cases at the time. And in 2011, Julia, who you all met in the film, she filed legal actions in every state across the country, as well as the first federal case. And through this partnership that I was involved in with Witness, we created these short films called Stories of Trust about some of the state plaintiffs. And at the time, that was when I met Kelsey, Juliana, and Shutesca Martinez, and Jamie Lynn Butler. They were all featured in these short films and had been involved in legal cases within their own states. And that was a really amazing grassroots campaign that we did with that series of films. And we had a whole social impact campaign that was directed at those films, and we were able to hand deliver them to President Obama. So it was really impactful for me, most particularly to see the power of the youth voice and how to their story. And 15, I knew the legal team at that point. I had built the trust with them because I had worked on these short films. And I also knew some of the plaintiffs and their families. So when they had their first win in 2016 with Judge Coffin, I approached the legal team and asked whether or not it would be possible to have exclusive access to tell this story. And for me, it was really, I think this case is really groundbreaking. It's a very novel way and a new way to think about climate change and impacts and also solutions. I had never thought about how the judicial system plays a role in climate justice. And I think that these cases really highlight the importance of our judicial system being a part of the solution. And the fact that the plaintiffs are young people, and they are the ones who are disproportionately impacted by the climate impacts, and it's their future to hold. That whole storyline was just really compelling to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's kind of continue along that line, and I want to turn to Nathan, because we know you know, Julia Olson, who runs our Children's Trust, you know, she's as Christi says, she's bringing these cases on behalf of young people who are the plaintiffs. And so I'm curious, from your vantage point, Nathan, what is it about young people in the way that they think about activism that might be different, say, from the way adults might go about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, I think that the way that I got involved in the case in the first place is really speaking to that. When I was about 15, I attended a meeting in the Alaska legislature in Juneau at our capital. And I was sitting in a meeting and I turned to the legislator next to me and he asked me why I was there. And I gave him my spiel about, well, I'm here on fishing specifically as it ties to climate change. And I just remember it was a moment where the response that I received from him was something along the lines of, that's really nice. We're really glad you're socially engaged. I'm like, keep pushing forward. It'll be nice when you can vote. It's kind of this interesting idea that really did come from many experiences when I was much younger, but still knew about climate change, where I would bring these issues forward. And there just really seemed to be this perception that you couldn't disconnect young people and their independent voice on climate from, you know, either the opinion of their parents or from, you know, the various ways in which they were already just being a talking piece for other people's agenda. And I think what was really important about Julia's pitch to me when she first reached out was her whole message was about, we are looking to uniquely uplift the voices of young people who are already doing the work wherever their respective states were. You know, I had been doing this work for years before Julia reached out, but I was really called to the way in which she was speaking with us and not for us, and really calling forth the work that we were already doing, but using this novel new, I guess you could say, channel of power. And I think especially the legal system is a really powerful way for young people to say, hey, you know, like, we're not actually asking anymore. Like, we deserve to have an equal seat at the table because you're quite literally gambling away our future in front of us. And that's not okay. And so I think that just having that in mind when she was reaching out to me, really, I could see it. I could see that vein of advocacy, and I thought it was really powerful. So I think that broadly, that just means that, you know, young people need the right to speak for themselves, and speak for their own generation, and be respected in having that independent advocacy that recognizes that, you know, there's a future at stake in addition to, you know, the short-term decision making that we're having now, and that they'll be around a lot longer.
Miko, what about you? How do you respond to that about, you know, how young people think about activism, and in particular, maybe how you see the relationship between climate change and intergenerational justice?
Yeah, I think back in the day, when we were just starting the lawsuit, I feel like the attitude surrounding children and politics was that they shouldn't be involved, and that, like, it was super outrageous for a kid to even know what's going on in politics. And I remember going with me and my brother, we would go with my mom to all these 350 meetings, and just like hearing all these people go like, I'm doing this for my grandkids, or I'm here for my children, and us being the only kids in the room and no one really asked us our opinions about it or anything like that. And similarly, I went to an event and someone was like, why are you here? It's a school night. I think it was like a city council meeting or something. And me and my brother explained why we were there and why we were testifying. And they were like, this isn't for you. Like, where's your parents? And we're like really annoyed that we were there and stuff. And building off what Nathan said, just like, I think the reason why I joined as well as my brother was that, like, and a lot of the other youth on the case, was that we are not of voting age, and we were just tired of seeing all these decisions being made on behalf of us, sort of in the name of, this is for the future generations, when it was really directly impacting our futures and just how we're going to be able to live on this planet. And so just like that attitude, I wanted to really change or be a part of changing the narrative. And hearing Julia to say that this case was specifically to highlight youth voices instead of speak over them was a really like huge seller for me. And that's why I think that I was really wanting to be a part of the case. And I think that this, just being a part of it and advocating for youth rights and being a part of that movement towards wanting to encourage youth to speak up and talk about their rights, sort of goes on the thing about intergenerational youth advocacy. I think that's what you said. Because I remember just being a kid and the attitude really reflected on kids my age because they didn't want to be a part of rallies or anything like that because that was supposedly like adult things or like college kids in like liberal arts. So just being a part of this movement and being part of the cases, I feel like has really helped towards that.
Thank you for that perspective. And Christi, I want to turn back to you for a minute because, you know, I know that Julia in another webinar said that she never would have let anyone near the young people to make a film except for you because of your compassion for the young plaintiffs. And my question for you is, you know, what kind of relationships did you form in you know, as a result of, you know, this series of films that became, you know, this larger film? And do you have a personal reason for caring so much about these young plaintiffs?
Well, do I have a personal reason? I have a daughter. I have a 21-year-old daughter. So she's, you know, right smack in the middle of this age group of these beautiful plaintiffs. So that has always very much been on my mind of what, you know, what kind of future my daughter is going to inherit. And definitely plays a role in my motivation to you know, to want to leave her and her generation with the best tools, if not the best planet that we can. I feel really fortunate to have earned the trust of, well, not only Julia, but of the plaintiffs and their families. I spent a lot of time, you know, very early on in filming with them. Of course, when we started this project, I already knew Kelsey and Shatescott and Jamie, and knew their parents and knew their family. And actually, I already knew I knew Hazel and Avery and Sahara as well. I hadn't worked as directly with them, but I knew them. So there was kind of already a little bit of this the trust built into this group. But I spend a lot of time with the young people before even putting a camera on them or recording. And there were so many opportunities, especially earlier on in the case, where they came together for various hearings or events that Our Children's Trust was hosting. And, you know, we'd all be in the same house together and living in the same house and going to the Waffle House and going to the park and going to DC and, you know, doing like everything you saw in the film. Like I was there with them and we were together for days, weeks on end. So I think I feel really privileged to have gotten to know them in the way that I have, and to be able to call them friends, if not family. And I mean, I think Miko and Nathan can maybe speak a little bit more directly to what that experience was like for them. But yeah, I feel incredibly privileged that they gave me that trust and you know, and also believed in this process. You know, 6 years ago, when I approached them all and told them that I wanted to tell their story and that, you know, I promise you someday it's going to be out there and people are going to know it, and for them to actually trust that that, you know, I had the best intentions and that I really wanted to get their story out in a big way and in an effective way. And, you know, we're extremely fortunate that, you know, we're premiering on Netflix on Friday, and the entire world will now have access to this film. And, you know, and I am so thankful for the plaintiffs having the patience with me, because it's been a long process, and I'm sure they didn't always believe necessarily that it was going to turn out how it did.
That's great. And congratulations on it going out on Netflix, by the way. And actually you led right into my next question for Miko and Nathan, which Miko, let's start with you. I mean, how did it feel to be filmed for the documentary? Was it comfortable, difficult? Did you feel a sense of trust around that right away, or did it take you a little time to settle into that?
Oh, definitely. I think Christi's a very comforting person. And so like meeting her for the first time and just like hearing her say, okay, we're going to sit down. I'm going to ask you a few questions in front of the camera and just like give your most authentic answer. Like it was really easy to do. Especially as Christi talked about, even the days that we were doing like press stuff in different cities and states, or like just doing stuff for Youth VGov and going into court, we would have time to just sit down and hang out. So we've definitely already had like sort of like a family environment. So being already comfortable with each other and being comfortable with the staff and the attorneys and stuff, like we all know each other. And so it was just like really comfortable to get to know Christi, and just like, it was just really easy. And I think when I was younger, definitely, I was like really amazed. I was like, someone wants to do a documentary on us, on this case. So I was kind of like flabbergasted at first, but like now that I'm a lot older, I'm just like, okay, where do I sit and stuff.
That's fantastic. And Nathan, how about you?
Yeah, I absolutely echo what Miko said. And I would also just add, like, very tangibly, in addition to Christi being very approachable, there was just this piece of, there would be these big flashy stories that would come out every once in a while in the case, when a milestone would hit, like a court opinion would drop, and suddenly there would be this frenzy of media attention. And, we'd be doing interviews and trying to get the word out. But I think the difference with Christi's team is that they were there always, through every part of it, through the lows that were not flashy, that were kind of behind the camera, I guess you could say. And, so I could see that they were capturing the real story, in addition to, the moments that kind of stick in history. They were also getting our emotions and filming when we were, crying about something devastating happening, or and I think that just subconsciously built that trust as well, that it was more than just, this is the big thing right now, because it isn't always going to be. And we knew that, right? We knew there was going to be periods of, kind of media silence. And so to kind of constantly have the documentary team making sure that we kind of had this piece of continuity, I think was really comforting, in addition to what Miko said.
Oh, that's great. It sounds like you were all really able to be vulnerable with one another throughout. So that's, that really does build trust in relationships. And, as you know, Interfaith Power Light works across religious traditions, spiritual traditions with people all over the country. And so I want to talk a little bit about faith in our conversation here. And, I understand that all of you are people of faith or spirituality. And Nathan, I want to start with you, I guess. I know that you have said that you had a Quaker upbringing, and I'm very curious to know how your Quakerism has informed your role as a plaintiff and your decision to take part in this case.
Yes, I'm so excited for this question. This is quite literally the first time I've been asked this question by anyone, and it's been 7 years, and it's wonderful. So I guess I'll say two things about the background of Quakerism, just as a faith, and how it is so important to this work. The first is, I guess, what we call spices. You could kind of cheesily say the spices of life, and that stands for simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equity, and earth care, or we say stewardship, but it's kind of synonymous. And so, that piece of stewardship has always been there. And, being born into a Quaker community, there were really tangible components of that just built into the faith. But I think the even more impactful kind of message that was always there there's this quote, and I wish I had the name off the top of my head, but back around the founding of the religion, there was a really famous Quaker who said, "What canst thou say?" And I think it even goes beyond Quakerism. It might be in other traditions, but it sounds archaic, but it's really getting at what are you doing to make heaven on earth now? And, Quakerism, historically and obviously into now really does have this kind of long history and being deep in a lot of social movements. And I think it's ultimately really tied back to that key foundation of what are we doing here right now for justice? Instead of only focusing, on where are we going after all of this? There's really that tangible component. And then specific to me and my role on the case, I absolutely cannot disconnect my church back in my hometown of Fairbanks from even getting into the case in the first place. I was driving back through Denali National Park in Alaska with my mother when I got the call from Julia Olson, and me as a 15-year-old who was all giddy. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to sue the federal government. And my mom immediately was like, no, you don't just sue the federal government. And we went back home, and I went through this long, really vital process in Quakerism called a Clearness Committee, or a clearness process. And it's basically where you kind of gather together a group of, the age really isn't important, but you could broadly say your elders. That doesn't really denote an age, but just people in your community that know you deeply. And intellectually, we might call it the Socratic method, but it's what we call it is kind of queries. And they basically pose really impactful, really kind of biting questions, but it's not for the purpose of throwing you off. It's for the purpose of getting you to come back to, is this the work that Spirit or God is calling me to do? And if you're not, and if they sense that you're not clear on that, they're going to keep pressing you on it and really call you on, I don't think you're quite ready for that yet, or I'm not hearing that. And my mom likes to call it the fire in the belly. And so I went through this long process, and once I had articulated to my church that I was sick of being kind of put down, and I was sick of being told that my voice wasn't important until I turned 18 and suddenly magically became important, right? Once I could articulate that in kind of more core value Quaker terms, I guess you could say, it became clearer that this was really the work I was meant to do. And since then, it's been, almost 7 years, and I have a support committee through my church where I have periodically been constantly tended by that community to kind of both keep me true to the work and to kind of, as I referenced earlier, get me through the lower points, especially since we had no idea going in that this was going to take this long and that it could take years longer, and having the kind of moral fortitude to be in it for the long haul. And so I think just those are some of the observations broadly that I think are really fundamental to Quakerism, and also just completely synonymous with how I view this work. And I think the last piece I'll just say is another really fundamental value in Quakerism is we like to say that there is that of God in everything. And I really emphasize everything, not just everyone. So, and it's certainly not it's not at all an idea that's unique to Quakerism. In fact, I think it has rather pagan roots as well. But it's really this idea that everything is interconnected, everything is sacred, and everything has that kind of piece of godliness in it. And so how are we speaking for all of us, and not just I guess you could say privileged few, or whoever happens to be at the top of the social hierarchy. And those are kind of the big observations that I've made over the years on Quakerism.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love that phrase, moral fortitude. I had to write it down. I thought that was really great. And Christi, I want to turn to you. I mean, talk to us a little bit about your spiritual grounding. Where are you coming from in this work?
Well, I was raised Seventh-day Adventist in Boulder, Colorado. And I don't know if I just happened to be privileged to grow up in a church in a special place. But my church definitely gave me that connection to the outdoors and to the environment. We spent the Sabbaths in the mountains and hiking and camping with friends. And, our focus when we were together with fellow congregants was really about being out in nature. I don't know if that has, I'm no longer a member of the church, and I don't know if that focus has changed, but I feel like that was really influential for me as a child and a teenager, growing up with that emphasis and environmental stewardship as part of what our core values were in our religion. And I think part of it probably was to be blessed where I did grow up, and that the outdoors and nature were so close to our daily life, and so such easily accessible. But yeah, I think I feel grateful for that experience in the church and for those leaders who connected us in that way.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, is that who are involved in this work, that special connection to the natural world and understanding the interconnectedness that we all share with the natural world. And Miko, I know that you come from a Jewish background, and I just wonder how, how your beliefs and your traditions help to motivate you, either how they help to get you involved in this case to begin with, or, sort of how they keep you motivated even now.
I think Judaism has been a huge part of why I wanted to take part of activism in the first place. And this is actually pretty fitting because Passover was last week, and part of Passover, that the tradition that I really love about it is that it really encourages, the religion in general encourages scholars to question what's been written and question certain things that have been said by different rabbis or different scholars. And even you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish, which is something that I really admire about Judaism. But going back to the topic of Passover, it really encourages kids to ask questions and ask why do we eat this way, and why do we sit like this, and why do we celebrate this holiday if it's about suffering and stuff. And I thought that's really stuck with me because as a kid, that being ingrained in my life, I've always been wanting to ask questions why does this happen, and why are we supposed to do this? And specifically when it came to me learning about climate change and our world leaders making decisions that completely oppose what we're supposed to do to make it better, I would always be like, that made no sense. Why did that happen? And another concept that's part of Judaism that has really stuck with me is called Tikkun Olam, which means repairing the world. And so those two things I've always taken with me in my activism, and especially when it came to me doing city council meetings and wanting to speak up against the LNG pipeline and all this stuff. And I remember right after we had just filed the lawsuit, I was kind of thinking oh, is this really something I want to do? I'm kind of nervous. There's so many people, there's people that are watching and people that are probably going to be really hating on us, who are a lot of us were not even adults at that time. So I was just really nervous. But I remember, I think my synagogue has been really, really supportive of me and my brothers since day one. And so I think they blessed me. It was kind of it wasn't similar to Nathan's experience, but it was kind of a congregation, a congregational moment where the whole community was there to really support us. And I was just I really took that with me, and I still take it with me to this day, to know that my faith and the people that practice my faith, as well as people who practice other faiths, are supporting us. And yeah.
It's really beautiful. I love that intellectual curiosity Thank you. Thanks for sharing those very personal stories. And Christi, I want to just quickly ask you a couple of questions before I pose my final question to all of you, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But I know that folks are wondering where the Juliana versus the United States case stands right now. So if you wouldn't mind giving us maybe a quick update of where things are.
Sure. So the plaintiffs filed, so the story basically ends with the Ninth Circuit Court decision and the 2-1 decision with the dissent. In last March, the plaintiffs filed a motion to amend their complaint with Judge Aiken in the district court. They had a hearing last June, and since then we've been waiting for a decision. It's taking forever and definitely building anxiety for all involved. But the premise of this motion is that it's very typical in lawsuits to file motions to amend complaints based on court decisions. And so the plaintiffs are trying to make their motion more in line with the Ninth Circuit Court decision and putting the emphasis and the focus on declaratory relief. So this is really similar to the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954, where the plaintiffs were asking for the courts first to declare that they had a constitutional right and that it was being violated. And that's what the plaintiffs are asking. And that's actually what the courts have already said. But they're asking for that to be the premise of the case. And we're very hopeful that Judge Aiken will rule in the youth's favor. I think there's a lot of anxiety that the Biden administration, DOJ, will take a similar approach to the Trump administration. So, I think there's a lot of fear that the Biden administration will file a writ of mandamus and, take the similar approaches to keep the case from going to trial. But a ruling from Judge Aiken in favor of the youth would put the case back on track to go to trial. And that is ultimately, a huge goal, because every single hearing that you saw in the film was a procedural hearing. Mm-hmm. These youth have never been able to testify. They've never been able to present their evidence before the courts, before the judges. None of their expert witnesses have ever gotten to testify. So I think this is a really important piece for folks to understand, is that after 6.5 years, these young people still have not had their real day in court to present their case.
Yeah, well, we certainly want you to have that day in court, and we're behind you all the way. So we'll also keep our ear to the ground for, whenever that ruling comes out. We'll be paying close attention. And one follow-up question, which is, I know that there are state level cases pending in many states, and that there is a case in Montana that seems to be gaining some traction. So do you want to just say a quick word about Montana?
Yeah, there's actually 7 pending state cases right now. And I will put a link in the chat for everyone to follow that. So the state cases that are pending and ongoing right now are in Alaska, Florida, Montana, North Carolina, Utah, Virginia, and Washington. And the Montana case is actually scheduled to go to trial next February. And it's very exciting. It's the first time that a youth-led constitutional climate change lawsuit is going to trial. So it's and Montana has a very strong constitution, and it's also where I live and where Sarah Paulus also lives. So we're very closely following that case and very excited, and really hoping that people will come out to support these cases. And I'll put a link in the chat so that you folks know where to go to learn more about the pending state case.
Great, thanks for dropping that link in, Christi. And so I have another question for all of you before we turn to questions from the audience. But my question, I want to start with you, Miko. My question for you is, how do you stay hopeful in this work?
I think the amount of support that we get from everyone, that's for one. And then that, and also I'm trying to think. There's so many ways that people have supported us throughout the years. I think being together, every step closer that we get to presenting our case and going to trial gives us a lot of hope. But also, not gonna lie, it is really exhausting to get our trial date removed multiple times. For the past, like, how many years has it been? Like 7, 5, 7, around that time. So I think, I mean, just everyone's support, but also just the amount of work that Christi has taken to make this documentary, and how that's been accepted through so many film festivals, and then now Netflix. I think that's really cool, because that's also, it reaches, Netflix has amazing outreach power. So just getting the word out and having people know about the lawsuit and getting us more support has been just been really hopeful for us. And I also just the amount of other lawsuits that have been popping up under Youth v. Gov. I think it represents that other youth are interested in lawsuits like ours and want to take part of the action that we're doing, not only in the United States, but also I think maybe not under our Children's Trust, but there's also been other actions that of other youth that want to be a part of something, want to be a part of stuff that Youth v. Gov has put out there and stuff. But I think, Nathan, what about you?
Yeah, Nathan, let's turn to you.
Yeah, I mean, tangibly for me, the first big thing that I have to constantly do to keep the faith is to kind of take a big step back and kind of recognize where we sit in the, I guess, what Martin Luther King called the moral arc of history. And just recognizing that we stand on so many decades of work that was laid before us to get us to this moment. And so constantly decentering ourselves and decentering the case even, as it's not the be all end all. And it's a constant push forward, but it's constantly helpful to not act as though the sky is falling when we lose in one vein, because there's been such a groundwork that's been built. And frankly, I think watching the youth movement in just the last few years, whether it's Greta or activists in America or activists in the global South, just it's showing that we're reaching a new moment in this movement. And I think the other vein of that that's really similar is in the legal system in particular. I'm a kind of a legal geek, as the plaintiffs go, and really reading how the narrative in the courts is changing. And it's already changing very tangibly. And especially with some of the more notable dissenting opinions that have come out since Justice Aiken's original opinion, that really was unprecedented in US history in recognizing the fundamental right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life. Other judges have now taken that and used that as basis for their dissents. And as Christi mentioned, some of our cases have ultimately been winning. And so it is a all hands on deck kind of broad push. So I think it's really important to keep that bird's eye view of where we're at, decentering ourselves and recognizing that we're actually making a pretty significant push forward collectively.
That's great. Christi, how about you? How are you holding on to hope?
Well, I think I think our young people today, and seeing their engagement and their dedication and involvement to this, and it's giving me more hope that folks like you and other organizations are providing a platform for these youth to share their story and to have their voices heard. And that we're getting much better at giving a seat at the table to young people. And I think they need to be present in the decision making and the solutions. And I think that we are slowly making that shift. And that does give me a lot of hope, because I think this generation is probably the most compassionate and tolerant generation that I've seen in my lifetime. And so I have to believe that good will come out of that.
That's great. I know we have a few questions from audience members, and so I'm going to invite Ashiki to join us here and share some of those questions with you.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you all. We have a couple of questions. One of them from the audience. Nathan, you briefly mentioned about Greta. We have Lewis who asked, why is there so much publicity around Greta Thunberg and virtually no publicity around this case, Youth versus Gov, Juliana versus United States? What do you all think, Nathan and Miko, is the reason for this?
It's an interesting question. You know, I think Greta, to give her a lot of credit, has been very clear from the get-go that this publicity that she is getting is for the movement, and she's constantly attempting to kind of divert you know, the media attention to where it needs to be, which is on the broader message of the movement. You know, when she came to the United States, for example, and testified in front of Congress, her message was, listen to the scientists, don't listen to me. And same thing when we hear about struggles for attention in the global South and really uplifting, you know, the unique impacts that climate change is already happening tangibly on the ground in, you know, whether it's in the Pacific Island region, you know, really having her use her platform to call attention to those areas. But I think one of the things that she's really up against, that our audience member with this question is referencing is, you know, oftentimes it's really hard for movements to kind of decentralize their message, because media really does like to latch on to, you know, like who's the crowning jewel of the movement, because that's just, you know, that's often how it works. You want the celebrity personality, you want the story that really ties around the unique story of one person. And so, you know, it is a challenge in these movements to make sure that we aren't, you know, kind of being accidentally celebrity-ified, or whatever the word would be for that. But I think, to Greta's credit, you know, I think this case is one component of a very large movement, and Greta is obviously often at the forefront of it. But I think that she does puts in a lot of work to make sure that the voices that need to be heard are being listened to at the same time.
Thank you. And also, Miko, would you like to answer that question as well?
I think Nathan said it all. I think also building off of, like, I mean, there's so many people that have their own stories that, like, and it's hard to cover 21 of us in this lawsuit, and Greta is one person. So it's easier to focus on like one person than 21 all at once. And then also, I think Greta's part of the movement that she was part of was Fridays for Future. So like, and that's like more of a, like, not to say Youth Speak Up isn't consistent, but that's more of a consistent like campaign. And because of everything going on in the courts and like having to wait for hearings and stuff like that, I think it's easier to hear more about Greta more than Youth Speak Up.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. And kind of part two-ish to that question for Christi. The question is, what did it take to get this film to run on Netflix? We know it's coming out on Netflix soon. And what is the media struggle like in this country, especially around the youth versus government film? So Christi, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have necessarily the answers to why people don't know about this case, or why, you know, there isn't as much coverage. I think part of it is that you know, maybe our society is not as inept maybe at dealing with more complicated, you know, digesting more complicated and look too complicated. I don't want to, you know, I can't understand that, but I can understand a protest or a rally in the streets. So and it's long, and it's something that you have to stay engaged with and understand the legalities and, you know, all of those points that we try to bring attention to in the film and educate people on. I think that's hard just for the general public to always wrap their head around. But I just can imagine that maybe that's a part of why it's not covered very much. So we had our film festival premiere at Doc NYC in November of 2020, so over a year ago. And in that time period, we were in 51 festivals and 52 festivals and received 26 awards, which was amazing. But nevertheless, it was, still not a given that we were going to find a platform or a home for the film. And it was a really long and arduous process, and really required a lot of persistence and dedication, and a lot of connections. And I have just like the most amazing team that works on all of this stuff with me, and they have connections and have the same persistence that I have had with this. And I never could have brought it, to fruition and gotten it onto Netflix without my team's support. But there's just some things that happened along the way, and between contacts and some of the screenings that we did, it did come to Netflix's attention, and their sustainability team was really connected with this film and helped us to get it there. And so we're incredibly grateful about that, because it really provides an opportunity for us to, for people across the world in over 30 languages to see this film. And, for those of you who don't have a Netflix account, or if you have friends who don't have a Netflix account, tell them to get a trial subscription for 14 days so that they can watch the film. And we also have educational distribution. So if there's teachers out there, or nonprofit organizations, or other congregations that are interested in screening the film, I'll put our website here in the chat, and they're welcome to reach out to us, and we can connect them with our educational distributor to get the film in their hands.
That's so great. It's great to hear that, the momentum is building for more publicity, especially on Netflix. That's super exciting to hear. And we may have time for 2 more questions here, but we're going to try to get through this one real quick. This is also for you, Christi. As you were producing the film, to what degree did you consider various religious communities as possible audience members? And did you omit or include certain elements to try to reach and include different audiences?
We were very conscious of just the political framing in America in general, whether that framing is coming from a religious background or religious standpoints or not. We were very conscientious of trying to make a film that was nonpartisan, in a way that it could speak to conservatives and liberals and people across the board and of any religion, so that we could really focus in on the facts of the case and the evidence of the case going back 60 years, and showing what each administration has known and has done, and the willful actions that they've taken in exacerbating the climate crisis. And so we did not want to tell a story that in any way, shape, or form alienated any type of group. And so I hope it doesn't. We spent a lot of time trying to make sure that it didn't. And when we did our test screenings during our rough cut stage, we invited folks from very diverse backgrounds and diverse age groups, so that we could get that feedback in terms of if there was elements of the film that were alienating or feeling like they were excluding some group of people. So yeah, I hope that's a good answer.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It definitely was an inclusive and diverse group of youth and young adults. So that's great. And we will squeeze in one more question here for Miko and Nathan. So the question for you all are coming from Robert. A lot of climate activists have been working on this problem for many years, but of course are in the middle of their adult lives. For Miko and Nathan, what is it like to literally grow up as part of this legal case? And does it make this process seem even longer and more frustrating? Who would like to start that question off?
I can start that. I would say it's definitely had its ups and downs on the broad view I've had of the legal system, but I think one of the really important takeaways that I continue to have is that kind of what I alluded to earlier, that it's a really large movement and it's taken decades to get to this point, and we're standing on the shoulders of a lot of other people who've already done a lot of the groundwork. So we really have to make sure that when we are, pushing our fight in the court system, that we're not just focusing on the trajectory of Juliana, but the trajectory of the legal movement as a whole. And also on a more personal note, I'm gonna shamelessly plug my two favorite podcasts that absolutely have become like godsends for me on staying grounded in this work. And the first is called Amicus with Dahlia Litwick, and the other one is called Strict Scrutiny. They're both total like legal nerdy podcasts, but I think the incredible power, especially of the work that Dahlia Litwick does on Amicus, is she interviews lots of really long-standing activists in movements like voting rights and civil rights of various types, LGBTQ rights, and it's always really grounding for me to find that the people who have been in the work the longest and who have been kind of at the short end of the stick for literally hundreds of years are actually the people who are the most grounded in their core values and in their missions, and are still the loudest and still speaking the loudest and doing the most, is basically how I would put it. And I think that when you can see these visionaries who have every excuse to kind of check out and they're still showing up, it feels much, much less okay for me to kind of abandon myself to nihilism and say, well, it's all hopeless because the legal system takes too long. First off, I think that's not true because we have so much tangible evidence of progress, but it's also speaking to, there are some people that don't get the choice to disengage because they've literally been at it forever. And they're also the ones who are the most grounded in their truth. And I think those two podcasts, Amicus with Dahlia Litwick and Strict Scrutiny, keep speaking that message specifically on the legal vein for me.
I totally agree. Those are two of my favorite. And Dahlia always is bringing in the most recent and updated cases that are going before the Supreme Court that everybody should know about.
So real quick, 60 seconds. Miko, would you like to answer that question as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, again, Nathan hit it on the nose, but I guess my personal experience, I think I joined this when I was like 14, and now well, tomorrow I'm gonna turn 21. So, I mean, I think on like surface level, I think it's easy for me to be like, yeah, this is really frustrating. Like the amount of time that we've had to wait because we should have been at trial a long time ago. Or I think in my senior year, I think that's when we were about to go to like our official trial date. But then like, I think there are other parts that make me feel grounded because it's not just our lawsuit that's making strides towards like that systematic change. There's also so many other organizations and so many other people that are doing their part. So like, I think growing up in this case and like being like working really hard towards that systematic change, it's easier to like for me to be like, this is it, like this is like the only thing that like will make the change, but that's absolutely not true. Like I think that it's like a lot of pressure being a part of like this type of thing at a young age and growing up in it, but knowing how many people are taking their part, it feels like, it makes me feel like, oh, I'm not the only one. And I remember, I don't know if Nathan and Chrissy, if you remember this, but I remember when we were in Eugene and we went to the Longhouse, and I think one of the Native elders was, he was speaking to us and he said like, you guys have done a lot of good work, but we want to let you know that we are not going to stand in front of you or stand behind you, but with you, holding your hands. And like that really stuck with me because I feel like when you're really young doing activism, it's really easy to feel helpless and feel like sometimes your voice is being you're being talked over, or people are talking over you, or you feel like you don't have space to talk, and like all the responsibility falls on you. But like it's really nice to know that there are people out there that, like, you know, like you said, are standing next to us holding our hands. So yeah.
Thank you all for the Q&A session, Christi, Nathan, and Miko. And we are a few minutes over time, but we thank each and every one of you for your time. And I'm going to hand it off to Sarah Paulos to close us out here.
Great. I just wanted to thank Christi Cooper and Olivia Ahneman for this generous offer of this film for IPL congregations. Over 450 congregations hosted a screening for their members, and some have already reported 100 attendees at their screening. So if you haven't seen the film yet, you can view it on Netflix, like Christi was saying, starting April 29th. And if you want to host a community screening, contact Christi for a license, and a recording is going to be sent of this conversation to everybody who registered, and it'll be posted on YouTube as well. So please share this recording with your friends. And this is an opportunity to drop your thanks in the chat box for all of our panelists today. And I just want to thank all of you attendees for joining us, and thank you to our panelists, Reverend Hendershot, IPL President, Christi Cooper from Barrel Maker Productions, Miko Vergun, and Nathan Bering. So all of you have a wonderful evening, and spread the good news about this film being on Netflix. Thank you so much.
Happy birthday, Miko.
And happy birthday, Miko.
Yeah.